Hi everyone, I'm Oliver, the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and welcome to this month's tea break, talking evidence and audiences. So as we were chatting, I hope you've got a drink in hand and just a chance to think about audiences and think about audience evidence as a sort of little hiatus in the middle of the afternoon. We're going today to be talking about enhanced audience spectrum. So the changes to the audience spectrum profiling system that we brought in recently, we've just worked out, was launched about 6 weeks ago. So we're going to be chatting through that, chatting through a couple of case studies, and my colleague Richard, who you may see on camera, is going to say just a few thoughts from his perspective as one of the first users of the new system. So that's what we're going to cover. There's a chance of Q&A at the end. If anything I'm saying on the way through doesn't make sense or you have any questions, do please pop them in the chat. I'll try and see them, but if not, one of my colleagues will hopefully flag them as well. So I think that's it by way of intro. Other than to say, if you want transcription, there is a button available on the bottom, and that's all switched on. And yeah, just shout if you need any help with anything. But other than that, let's have a bit more of a look at audience spectrum in its new form. Now, I'm assuming that everyone coming to this knows enough about audience spectrum to know what it is and to have come along on that basis. But just very, very basic preamble. Audience spectrum is the audience agency's in-house population profiling tool that splits the whole population into 10 segments at the top level. More about that later. Based on the kinds of cultural things that people like to do, and that's then linked to demographics, to geographical pinpointing, and allows us to look at populations of a whole area or populations from a list of postcodes or households or other data sets, and say what kind of people are in that mix. So that's audience spectrum. It's been running for a few years now, and it's just got better, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, broadly speaking, if you'll let me click on, essentially what's happened is that we've, amongst a couple of other tweaks which I'll mention, but the big difference, the thing that will make most difference to you, is that we've split the top tier segments into a secondary tier of subsegments. So each one is split in two. So anyone who is in an existing segment is now in one of the two subsegments related to that segment. And we split that based on arts engagement data that we've got, particularly from Audience Finder, our audience data aggregation tool. Also things like geography, where people are, who they are, and other things that we've got used to from working with Audience Spectrum very closely with hundreds of arts organisations over the last few years. So places we know that certain distinctions are really, really useful, things that we know really seem to matter in terms of how people are engaging. So we've used all of that kind of in the mix to then split out these subsegments. The result is that we've got 20 subsegments compared to the 10 top tier segments. And there's a couple of other little tweaks we've done on the way through as well. The most prominent of those probably is we've changed the name of two of the top tier segments. So what was Facebook Families is now Frontline Families, and what was Heydays is now Supported Communities. But nothing else about those groups has changed. So it's the same people in the same categories. Any of your pre-existing profiling or plans or reporting or analysis, all of that's still valid. You just need to, find and replace the new name, essentially. As you can probably guess, that's partly about taking out brand names because, we don't really want to be advertising Facebook as part of the segments, but also people's use of Facebook changed. And also just to make them a bit more accurate and fit the segments a bit better, as may become obvious as you look into them more. We've tweaked a whole load of other stuff that goes around it, how it's presented, the icons, we've done the classic thing of making all the icons simpler, easier to read, all that kind of thing, better suited for mobile, all that sort of stuff. But the really big difference, and what we're mainly going to be chatting about, is the idea of these two subsegments to each segment and what that might mean and do. So we've gone from having 10 on the left there, high, medium, low engaged, to 20 subsegments, with each of those split out into two in these pairs. Now, I'm not expecting you to read all of these in detail. We will share the slides. You can have a look at them. All of this is also on our website, but it's just to show just quite how much more variety there is, therefore, in the population, particularly because in some places, there's a few segments that have been a really big part of the population. So having more subsegments allows you to go from, so let's say in bits of East London, 3/4 of the population with 3 segments. Well, now 3/4 are from 6 subsegments. So you get a little bit more granularity, a bit more variety, a bit more chance to differentiate. And the same will apply elsewhere. So that's what we try to do, just to split it out into more detail. Some of these are split more strongly on engagement, some of them more strongly on demographics. It's a real mix between them in terms of how they're divided. But hopefully you'll start to see in practice why that's helpful. And we're going to talk through a couple of examples to kind of show why the subsegments might be a kind of useful tool to have. Everyone with me so far? Is this sort of making sense? Good. So this is these just so you have them for reference later in more detail. So we'll be talking about actually experience seekers. We'll talk about the difference between a couple of those different those subsegments, particularly in relation to things going on in Sheffield. We'll also talk about we'll touch on the difference in the dormitory dependables and the middle engaged groups, as well as talking a bit about frontline families and up our street. And that's particularly in relation to levelling up. So this kind of this government theme, priority, etc. And how this, it tells us something different if we use the subsegments than if we use the segments overall. So that's the plan. So start with looking at levelling up, which hopefully is an idea which will survive the Conservative leadership election. But it's essentially every local authority in the country has been allocated to one of 3 bands of priority for levelling up. So priority 1, high, priority 2, medium, priority 3, low. And this is those mapped. So the dark purple is the high priority areas. So you can see big bands in southern Scotland, Wales, the Kent coast, but particularly there's this band across the North Midlands and the North, just around here. And this is the bit that we're going to be looking at in a bit more detail now. And of course, and this is part of what we said when we did the initial launch of Audience Spectrum, as you would expect, more of the typically lower engaged Audience Spectrum segments tend to live in high priority levelling up areas. I mean, of course they do, that's exactly what you'd expect to happen. But where it's a bit more interesting is that if we actually look at the profile for category 1, category 2, category 3, each of these subsegments, we see that 2 of them really stick out as being unusually prominent in the category 1 areas, and that's the ease. So this is where we get the up our street and frontline families kind of rising to the fore as these particular groups of interest in this area. So this is just that zoomed in bit of the chart, and as you can see, they're massively more overrepresented in the category 1 areas than their equivalent sort of other subsegment. So up our street U1, which tends to be a bit more middle-aged, is only slightly overrepresented. The older up our streets category is massively overrepresented. Frontline family 1, which tends to be a bit more middle-aged, only slightly more overrepresented. Frontline families 2, which tends to be younger in that instance, is massively overrepresented. So it's really these 2 key groups that stand out as the kind of distinctive profile of people within these levelling up areas. Which of course means that if we're thinking about what would you do to engage audiences that are in these areas, it's not just enough to think about, oh, there's loads of frontline families, we'll look at them, there's loads of up our streets. Knowing the particular characteristics of these subtypes becomes more important because it differentiates them a bit more. So that's what we said at launch, and it's all true, but I thought I'd try and push it a little bit further today and just get a little bit more granular with what we can say about them. So this is where we get into sort of splitting them out into these into groups. So we're just looking here at the local authorities that are in the high priority levelling up areas, just in the North and North Midlands. And what I've done is I've split these into 4 groups based on whether they have below average for this group numbers of U2 and F2, or higher for both, so lower for both is grey, higher for both is purple, and then others which are more distinctively one or the other. So if they've got quite a lot of the Frontline Families 2 group, they're pink. If there's got quite a lot of the Up Our Street group, they're blue. And what we can see from this, from just a very quick glance, is that it's the major northern cities, particularly, that have really high concentrations of this F2 group. So high in Leeds, in Nottingham, in Manchester, and areas just outside the centre of Liverpool. On the other hand, when we start looking at the areas that are higher for U2 but lower for F2, we're getting more into some of these some particular former industrial areas, but areas that are just slightly further out or slightly smaller than some of those major urban centres. So areas like North East Lincolnshire, covering areas like Grimsby, Cleethorpes, Bassett Law, Chesterfield, Mansfield, the Wirral. So they're near big urban centres, they're not quite sort of in them. And then of course there's a whole load of areas which are just high for both, because it's, these groups are distinctive of this whole area, and there's lots of them, particularly in Lancashire and in the the old West Riding. So where I'm going to go to next with this, and this is part of my ongoing campaign to kind of normalise scatter plots, is to show those as a scatter plot. So this is looking at, on the x-axis, the percentage of U2, so the Up Our Street 2 category, so the higher to the right, the percentage of F2 higher at the top, and you can see we've got this distinctive group. So the pink group, top left, there's lots of those big cities. We've got the blue group, sort of bottom right. Top right is the other places that are both, and then I've left blank the other ones, so we're just a bit low for either. And you saw there was that big band through the kind of Peak District and the bottom of the Pennines, as well as sort of rural areas. So why does this matter? Well, really the key thing is that when we're looking at engagement in this particular category or broad type of area, there are very different things going on, different segments, different needs, different interests, different tastes, different comms channels, and things that will be successful in one place won't be successful in another. So this helps us really zoom in on those particular subtypes and why that'll be useful. Incidentally, because we're going to talk about them in a bit, if Sheffield was category 1, which bizarrely it isn't, it's category 2, it would sit there in terms of these proportions. So it's similar to all these big northern cities, it's just category 2, but we'll come back to that for the next example. So what we're seeing is, in terms of the priorities, interests, etc., of these two different subsegments, is they're really quite contrasted. So they're both relatively low engaged in terms of arts and cultural and institutional stuff generally. But one group tends to, the F2 group tends to skew younger, it tends to skew towards families, it tends to be more online, it's much more digital, with lots of social media, particularly those three that are listed there, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, so lots of kind of video content and stuff like that. Yes, they're both price sensitive, but maybe looking for different things in their cultural engagement. So F2's motivated by things that are entertaining for families. They're big computer game users of various sorts, so that might factor into maybe how things are presented, or even some gamification approaches, the kinds of things that might be an interesting hook. So if that's the skew for that group, the skew for the other group is really very different. So they're much older, they're more traditional, they're potentially looking for stuff that's kind of both traditional and popular. So it has, it's not stuff that's sort of arty or high art or kind of off-putting or has big barriers around it. They're also, being older group, relatively likely to have physical access needs, but less likely to need things like places to park prams or baby change or anything, that thing, which is much higher for the other group. And then again, if you look at the comms preferences, these are really low on social media, but they do things like read the local press. So what we're seeing is very different people wanting different things, looking in different places. And of course, for that big sway, the purple areas we saw, they've got both groups there. But I think this makes it clear that catering to both groups at once might be tricky. So you may need to think about, what do we do that works for the F2 group? What do we do that works for the U2 group? Is there enough for each? And recognizing they could be concentrated in very particular local areas, and neither group travels a lot. So you probably do need to be thinking about what's the cultural offer relatively local to home for both of these. So hopefully that makes sense as an initial illustration of where these particular subgroups give more richness and insight into what was otherwise quite a broad category in terms of, leveling up areas. It gets a lot more granular. And of course, you can look up your own particular local authority if you're in this patch, and find where you are on that overall picture. So that was example one. So do we have any questions lurking in the chat? None that I have seen so far. In which case I will surge on with example two, but do feel free to save up any questions if you have any for later on. So this study two is one that's nice and close to home for me for two reasons. One, I live in Sheffield, but secondly, it was the first place I worked. Well, it was first job in sector at least, working at what was Sheffield Galleries and Museums Trust there. Now, Sheffield Museums is a merger of what was Museum Sheffield, but also the Industrial Museum Trust as well. So there's big new collection of museums across the city. And again, we use this as the introductory case study at the launch. I'm going to take that and push it a little bit further again. So here's what we said before. We said Sheffield Museums, a big chunk of their audience is experience seekers. So it's one of the highly engaged groups. They tend to be younger, varied in their tastes, more inclined to go to things which are maybe low cost or different and varied and so forth. But it's a really big group for Sheffield Museums. About a fifth of visitors, according to their audience finder surveys, which they collect brilliantly large numbers of, so they can get some really granular insights. Sure enough, if we take this, we can see experience seekers, for all that that's true as an overall profile, have actually two very distinct flavors. So experience seeker one is the kind of early or mid-career professionals often, a tendency to be a little bit older, more likely to have families, more likely to be a bit more settled, more likely to be a bit more suburban. And then experience seekers two tends to be students, recent graduates, still living in student areas, maybe tending to live in more diverse areas as well. And they're more likely to be a bit younger. So both segments are kind of more likely than average to have degrees, but some of them are in the process of getting them as opposed to having already got, for example. And we looked at their data and we saw a really clear picture that yes, experience seekers were big overall, but they were behaving different ways. So the E1 group, who tend to have lived in the city longer, they tend to be a bit older, they tend to have families. Sure enough, they were more likely to be previous visitors. They were more likely to be attending with children. They were more likely to, as we said, live out in the suburbs. They were more likely to connect with the bits of the collection which were about family-friendly content or city history. So all of that kind of seemed to bundle together quite neatly. And the E2 group, more students, graduates, they're more likely to be new to the city. They're more likely to be new attenders. And if they're not new attenders, they're more likely to be recent attenders because they've just arrived in the last few years and then come in and explore maybe. And generally speaking, if they're going to stuff, they're going with their friends. So it's adult groups as opposed to groups of children. Then we looked at the geography and we saw that, I mean, because Sheffield has two universities, one based bang in the middle, one based, slightly further out. And sure enough, those are the two postcode areas with large concentrations of the E2 group. So far, so neat a picture. They're doing exactly what we would have expected, but they are quite different. And you can probably see from these how if you were doing marketing campaigns or looking at motivations or which content people might be interested in, or indeed even just where they might be in order to contact them, there are differences. But we're going to sort of flesh that out a little bit more now. So, second attempt to normalize scatter plots. The more I do this, the more it's like it becomes a normal thing. So this time, what we've done is we've taken all of the survey respondents across the whole of the trust, and we've said what proportion of the profile are, so what proportion of each segment, or each subsegment of the profile within Sheffield, and that's the bottom axis, what proportion are they of the profile of non-Sheffield residents, and that's the vertical axis. So we can see for particular subsegments, are they more Sheffieldy or non-Sheffieldy, if that's a word that you're going to allow me. So to take an obvious example, the experience seekers we've been talking about, there's absolutely tons of them in Sheffield. Sheffield is like an absolute hotbed of experience seekers, massive chunk of the population. We said that 1 in 5 of the overall audience was experience seekers. If you just look at the Sheffield audience, or attenders from Sheffield, it's almost double that. It's almost 1 in 5 for each subsegment. So they skew very heavily that way. The other ones I'm going to look at is just to grey out all the others. So we've got those two which are very, very Sheffield based, both of them. And then we look at dormitory dependables, the sort of yellowy, greeny colour, and then frontline families, the blue ones. We can see there's a difference between each of the subtypes. So in both instances, the subtype that tends to be younger, that tends to be more in built-up areas, that tends to be a bit lower income, are disproportionately likely to be visiting from Sheffield as opposed to visiting from elsewhere. So the kind of local audience is skewing that way, even for these other types. That makes sense. So again, you can see there's quite big differences here, like 3 times proportion within Sheffield for the F2 group as the F1. So there's some notable distinctions, and it's just worth being aware of that, because if you were, let's say, in the marketing team at Sheffield Museums thinking we want to engage frontline families, it's worth being aware that if you're doing any campaigns locally, it's the F2 group you're really going for as opposed to the F1 group. So they have different tastes. They tend to be younger, they tend to be lower income. They're more likely to have young families, and so on and so forth. Okay, does that all make sense so far? So just thinking about that families angle, so we've said that of the experience seekers, the E1 group tends to be and have families, the E2 group tends not to. So let's sort of, if you like, test that theory against local geography. So this is Sheffield in all its glory, spilling out into the Peak District, up on the western northern side. And this map is showing by intensity how many experience seekers there are. So the darker it is, regardless of the colour, the darker it is, more experience seekers. So essentially, the experience seekers are all in or around the ring road. It's really right into the centre. But then we've coloured it to say, within that particular ward, are there more of the E1s, so they're purple, or are there more of the E2s, so they're orange? And what we see is a really clear picture where it's a north-south split around the city, with the north being more the student areas, which is where the universities are. South is more purple, and then when you get out into the northern suburbs, again, you flip back to the kind of more suburban E1 type. So really big differences, really clear distinction. But also, if we just look at that central, it's almost like a diamond shape, from sort of Walkley, and then the sort of 3 or 4 below it, with just that one dark purple one at the bottom, that little diamond there in the middle. That's our kind of experience seeker heartland. So if you keep a sort of focus on that bit, I'll now show where the families tend to live in the city. And you see that most of that diamond is pretty low for families, and most of it is the E1 category, so the E2 category. And the exception is that little pocket at the bottom, where there are high concentrations of families, and they tend to be that more family-friendly, family E1 type. So that's where we're seeing the concentrations of these groups. So if you're looking at like doing promotions that really reach experience seekers of one type, you might be talking about completely different bits of the city and different partnerships and campaigns and different bus routes you might want to advertise or whatever. Again, but from really quite concentrated hotspots. And for those that know Sheffield well, Nethered and Sharrow has a very particular character, and that character is essentially experience seekers. The other thing though, just to finish off, is to pull out, we've looked here at the family picture and said, this is where the families are and how that links to the E1, I suppose, E2 groups. But we can also look at that F2 group that we were talking about before. So the frontline families, which was this kind of much more Sheffield based than further afield. And sure enough, 4 areas of the city that they come from in highest concentrations are these dark areas on the east end of Sheffield: Manor, Burngreave, Firth Park, Shire Green, Brightside, where they're present in much higher concentrations. So again, if you're looking for a family audience, that's where they are, but you know it's this very particular subtype and the characteristics around that's who you're looking for. So hopefully that's an illustration just based on one particular city of how these subtypes allow you to kind of negotiate that kind of local geography. Also, understand the differences of how to target different things, different people. That's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Richard to just give a couple of reflections from his experience as an early user of audience spectrum subsegments, and then any questions you've got after that, that'll be great to hear. So Richard.
Thanks, Ollie. Those are really good insights. I've been taking a few notes as I've been going through. I think both examples for me demonstrate that extra power that the second tier, the more granular layer, can bring. It's certainly something we've been seeing as we've started to use it on projects within the research team. I think you mentioned it, but in the previous 10 segments audience spectrum, because it's across the population, when you start to look at clients, audiences or customers or visitors, you can often find that 3 or 4 segments makes up over 60%, 2/3 of their visitors. So this definitely gives another level to kind of like work with in certain situations. I think what I'm seeing as well from beginning to use it with clients is that the second tier can have a kind of 2 relationships to the top tier. Sometimes you find the second tier kind of splits the top tier in half, so you have kind of 2 equal sized segments to work with, but with different kind of needs and locations. And sometimes what happens within an area or someone's audience profile is actually when you go to the second tier, you find it's mainly made up of one of the sub tiers, and that's kind of almost focuses the profile. It's something I noticed not too far away from Sheffield, actually, in Leeds, where we've done some analysis of the residents across Leeds. And again, with experience seekers, it's 18% of the population. It's a real chunk of Leeds population, but it breaks down to 10% A1, 8% E2. So that's one of those examples of the roughly equal split. And similar to what you see in Sheffield, really different. The E2s is picking up the large student population there, which share a lot with the E1s, but actually the types of techniques and the needs of them in terms of marketing and engaging are actually quite different. Another example was frontline families in Leeds, where it made up 17% of the Leeds population. Again, another big chunk, but it splits down into 13% F1 and only 4% F2. So that's an example of one where it's really kind of polarized focused what one would do locally into the older of the two subsegments. So that's, I think, my first reflection. I think the second reflection here is that because you've focused on quite a small number of segments, just for this presentation to show the stats, it's worth remembering that, thinking audience development wise, you're thinking across all of the segments, and it's often the case that if you can actually kind of build a bit of a matrix where you have the segments, and then you can build a table where you say, well, what might they see? What are their needs? What might the barriers be, the opportunities? What are the kind of marketing ideas? That you can actually build quite a nice kind of matrix there and look for commonalities, but also look for differences. And it's something you can make quite locally distinct as well. You can actually say, well, what actual local events might these people be seeing? I think the third reflection is just, I think it's reiterating what you said really, but you've got something about the second tier breaking down kind of needs, characteristics and profiles, but it also is that bit about geography. I think that comes through quite clearly in your examples, but also in some of the analysis that we've been doing. If you're a venue, if you're a place that people are visiting, then it's really useful to think maybe in terms of your local catchment, but also further kind of rings of catchments outside as well, because there'll be some quite different kind of motivational factors that will draw people in from further, and there might be some more opportunities very locally to take kind of events or performances to some of the harder to reach segments as well. So yeah, I think that's something that's come through for me. We are looking to develop a free mapping tool that anyone can access, that you'll be able to zoom in on local areas and actually look at the profiles, the dominant segments, and also the segment distribution. So that should be something, a good resource for people to use. I think the last thing is to say, although this second level is really adding something, I don't think it replaces tier one. I feel that it has to be used kind of alongside. If you're looking at understanding a local area in real detail, then tier two works really, really well. But when I've been looking at clients about understanding kind of visitors to an area, or people from a kind of national profile, sometimes then actually tier one is quite good to use. It's certainly less colours for me to find on a colour palette to put on a map. I find 20 quite challenging. So I think there's just quite an interesting point about, in some cases, 20 segments. If any of you have used Mosaic, that has around 16 for each, but 67 types, actually using them both together for different purposes, or if there's one top level segment that's got a tiny percentage of your audience or people living in your area, you might want to keep that intact as a top level segment and use it alongside some more split out tier two segments. So yeah, I think that's the main stuff that I saw, Ollie. I think from your evidence team, what's good with this is that you'll be hopefully rolling out more insights over time as we go. You know, what you've done here is just an example of stuff, and that we can respond to kind of any new issues. We've got a long running survey that's really been tracking COVID, but now is moving into things like cost of living issues and stuff like that. So hopefully we can give more of a rolling outputs and developments on the segments, and therefore respond to any questions that you'll have, or real burning needs in terms of, I'd really love to understand how the segments break down by X or Y. I think that's it.
Fine. Well, thank you very much.